Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and I'm delighted to be joined by special guest Helen Bradley, our very own National Lead for Monitoring Officers and Governance, and the election winner to be endorsed by the AGM next week for our next Deputy Vice President. Helen Bradley, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you, Helen. Hello, everyone.
Now, I hope everyone had a good Easter break. Some schools are back today, whilst others have another week to go. So it might seem more quiet than usual, but no doubt, no less busy. We've got elections absolutely on our doorstep, and most eyes will be on those. We will probably return to that later. But first, Helen, I want to get your take on recent coverage around OFLOG. Before we discuss that, where do you see the role of the monitoring officer in respect of the obligations we know about in the reporting to OFLOG?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a bit of a lack of clarity, really, in terms of how the obligations will work. But I think on a very high level, my view would be is that the role of the monitoring officer is no different, really, to that in overseeing the local authorities' completion of the annual governance statement and the code of corporate governance. The various different steps and mechanisms that we have in place across the authority to ensure good governance. So I would hope that there is a similarity in that, and that we're able to use our experience in relation to those to assist us with regards to the reporting of OFLOG. And clearly we'll have an overarching responsibility to ensure that our authorities meet the requirements of OFLOG. I'm interested in the sort of early warning system that OFLOG is intended to provide, in the sense that it's looking to spot potential failure and service implications at an early stage to avoid it happening. Now, on the one hand, I think, well, actually, yes, that would be quite useful. Although one would hope that those early warning signs would be visible within the authority without OFLOG, and that those are being actively monitored. They certainly are, would be on the radar in my own authority, and I'm sure is the same is true of our listeners' authorities. But I suppose if you're in an organisation where your monitoring officer doesn't have the line of sight that it perhaps should to the corporate management team, then I suppose the gathering of data that highlights those early warning systems might be quite helpful. But I think for me, we still need to know a little bit more about how this will operate in practice, and overcome that concern that it's going to be another layer of bureaucracy that just adds to the burden of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I think that's right. I think the resource implications are probably quite concerning for local authorities, and also whether or not they readily, in all areas of metrics, have the ability to extrapolate the data, quickly and easily, because I'm not sure that is going to play out across all local authorities. So it's I think it is slightly concerning, but I mean, there's no point panicking, because we just don't have the detail. As you said, the corporate plan is very strategic, rightly so, but until we really understand, and obviously at the moment there is the website, so we can see the sort of trajectory of travel, but we don't really know, what they'll be specifically looking at, what will trigger a visit, and all those other elements, will we?
No,
at the moment,
that's right.
Yeah, I think there are interesting reports in the MJ this week regarding the LGA's view that DLUC has not engaged as promised with repeated efforts by the LGA and the wider sector colleagues to co-design the Office for Local Government. That appears in a written evidence report to ministers. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Helen.
Yeah, so I've seen some of that coverage over the last couple of days, and there is definitely concern in the sector around the fact that the OFLOG will sit within the Department of Levelling Up, although, as Secretary of State, Michael Gove would have no delegated, he's not delegated any statutory powers as far as we know.
No, but he could do, couldn't he? I suppose.
He could, but that, that potentially just undermines trust in the system, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I think the very fact that it doesn't sit alone as an independent body, and that's why, at the early stages, people talked about it, didn't they, as an audit commission by another name and all the rest of
Hmm.
it. But the audit commission was independent, and this isn't. It is sitting inside, and obviously Lord Morse has now stepped down, so we don't know, um, who will replace him in a permanent position. So I think, at the moment, there's just so much flux. But just having a look at the way in which the public might understand all this data, because there's already a phenomenal amount of data, isn't there, attached to local authorities, and wading through it to be able to get anything meaningful, even as an officer or a councillor, actually can be challenging, I think.
Yeah,
um,
that's true.
yeah, let alone a member of the public just trying to find out how their local authority is doing. So again, it reported in the MJ, the Chartered Institute in England and Wales have suggested that councils could be ranked by a traffic light system to make it easier for the public to understand the overall picture of an authority. How do you feel about that kind of warning system, Helen? Do you think it's going to work?
I think I would be concerned by such an approach, and actually how useful that would be. You know, similar to the concerns that are raised, with Ofsted, in terms of, you're given an overall rating and ratings in relation to particular categories, but actually, how helpful is that? Because if you look at local authorities up and down the country, we are different sizes, have different functions. We have different social and economic factors, which undoubtedly will impact on information provided into OFLOG, and therefore potentially on what is seen as whether or not we are well performing or not. And how do you take account of the context of all the individual local authorities? So I think an arbitrary sort of traffic light ranking system won't necessarily tell residents the full picture. I also think there's an inherent challenge of that kind of system, is that it really becomes about how effective you are at responding to OFLOG and providing information, and actually the focus becomes on that rather than actually delivering for our residents. And then, that's as you've referenced, the challenges around resource and the additional burden that this potentially brings on officers to do things at a time when, we are going right through yet another round of austerity and staff cuts and savings, where we are being required yet again to do more with less. This is an additional burden that they'll have to pick up. And what does that do to morale? If you work really hard at producing, delivering on your day job, delivering for your residents, and then don't get the rating that you would like from OFLOG, and you're rated red, what does that do to your staff morale? We've talked in various forums about the level of abuse that councillors and council officers
That's
are
right.
increasingly facing. If you work for an authority that's not ranked green, does that increase your exposure to more unacceptable behaviours? And we know that local government has a recruitment and retention challenge. If you're a red authority or an amber authority, does that impact on your ability to actually attract and retain the best staff? So I understand that the public need to have confidence in the services that we are providing, and also our performance, and we need to be held to account for that. I just think we need to do it in a way that is meaningful, and adds value, and isn't unnecessarily bureaucratic or simplistic.
Well, I think you make some really excellent points there, and points that be interesting to think about whether the sector has actually considered that the potential impact of the effect in relation to abuse against councillors, specifically, actually, because we know that that's deteriorating. But it's easy to sit back and criticise, isn't it? For me to look at it and think these are worries and concerns, and we don't have anything laid out, and but the thrust of this, in relation to the design of it all, really comes down to opening up even more transparency and accountability within the sector. And I think that just simply has to be a good thing.
Absolutely. I just think it's the way you go about achieving
Yeah,
that there's
yeah.
the important thing.
Now, turning away from central government for a moment, LLG is currently out for consultation on the Code of Practice on Good Governance for Statutory Officers. This is an important piece of work which has been produced jointly with Solus and CIPFA. And I'll just give specific thanks to Philip McCourt here from Brevin Britain, and of course you, Helen, because you inputted into the document as well. The Code of Practice for Good Governance sets out the expectations for Chief Executive, Chief Financial Officer and the Monitoring Officer in local authorities. And the code aims to support these roles to work effectively together and to deliver good governance. Now, the consultation closed last Friday, so we're collating all of those responses. But tell us why you think the code was needed, Helen.
Well, I think, as you say, this is a really important piece of work because for the first time, we have a document that actually sets out the role of the three, statutory officers in one place. Particularly the role of monitoring officer, because unlike the chief exec and the section 151 officer, there's less written or less understood
Right.
about what that role is about and the statutory responsibilities. So I think having a document that sets those three out, and then the interrelationship between the three roles as well, which is important, is helpful for a number of reasons. I think firstly, anybody coming into those roles, or aspires to go into those roles, it has a clear view as to what the responsibilities are and therefore what's likely to be expected from them. And it provides a really good framework for the basis of the relationship between the three roles, which is useful if you have a triangle that isn't perhaps as working as effectively as it perhaps could be, where there isn't parity of seniority and respect amongst the three. If you're whether it's a monitoring officer or section 151 who isn't feeling part of that triangle in the way that they should, then you can point to that framework and say, this is how we should be working together. This will ensure best practice, which monitoring officers particularly who haven't been at the top table have really missed, because there isn't anything that they can point to that says, look, this is how we operate and this is the basis for what I'm proposing. And equally, it will help members to understand the nature of our roles and responsibilities, and it can be pointed to on the rare occasions that members question our roles or seek to try and undermine the statutory responsibilities that we have. So I think it plugs a gap that has been there for a long time, and I'm delighted actually that the response to the consultation has been as good as it has, and particularly chief executives and section 151 officers have been very positive about it as well. And I think having CIPFA and Solus on board has really helped us engage with their audiences as well.
I couldn't agree more, and I do think it's a fantastic document. There's still, areas that will need to be tweaked. You won't have had sight. We've only just received, the final submissions, and I'd like to thank the membership for engaging in this process, because we've had quite a lot of engagement, and it's really, really pleased to see that, because obviously we want this to be fit for purpose, to be the best it can, to be able to enable monitoring officers to do their very best and have their tools available and access and respect and all the rest of it that ought to just apply to the role without having to do this. But we live in a complex world, don't we? So within the code itself, there's been developed these principles of the golden triangle, I suppose off the back of thinking about the Nolan principle. So there's been some principles put forward. I think there's 7 of them. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Helen, because it's quite difficult. If a principle makes it in, it's obviously really important. But I think it'd be interesting for me to hear perhaps what your 3 most important principles are within the golden triangle as set out in the code, would you say, and why? Sounds like an interview question.
It does. I think the top three for me are probably the three things that we were really trying to um, clarify stroke codify when we started the exercise. And um, I think the first one is that understanding the roles and responsibilities of the three posts and having that set out where you can signpost to and be very clear that these are our roles and responsibilities, and these need to be respected, um, both within the Golden Triangle itself, but also across the whole authority. And as a reminder that as statutory officers, we have a right, of inquiry and need to see everything, as it were, which I think sometimes that area is lost sight of. Secondly, I would go with the robust working arrangements. So, making sure that we have sight of the big ticket items, that we're present for the strategic discussions right at the outset, rather than sort of part way through or at the point at which something's going to come before cabinet. And, as we know, it's particularly important for the monitoring officer to be involved in those strategic discussions so that they can consider the legality and lawfulness and the correct governance processes to ensure that the decision-making processes are followed correctly. And then I think as part of that is actually not losing sight of the important relationship that we should have with the Chief Internal Auditor. There are other colleagues across the council, and that assist us in discharging our responsibilities. And of course, the Chief Internal Auditor has their own responsibilities, and actually they play a really useful role in helping the three statutory officers within the triangle discharge their duties. So I think that's really helpful to set out. And I think in authorities that already have really strong relations between the three statutory officers and generally have good governance, actually bringing in the Chief Internal Auditor into those discussions periodically is perhaps an area that they might look to do if they don't do that already. And then my third one would be around resilience and the importance of appointing deputies, but also actually developing a culture within your services and teams so that they understand your role as a statutory officer and actually what your responsibilities are, and actually help you discharge those by being your eyes and ears. With the best will in the world, we can't be at every single meeting. We can't have oversight of every single report or proposal that comes through, and we need to rely on it on others to do that. And I think building that resilience really helps us to perform our role and discharge our statutory responsibilities. But not only that, we actually help develop the statutory officers for the future, because they will get to see and work with the statutory officers, understand the roles and responsibilities, and actually it becomes almost a natural progression for those who are supporting the statutory officers to progress into those roles at some point in the future themselves.
Yeah, I mean that's so important, and good leaders encourage and educate and share knowledge to develop their members of their team. They don't act in a protectionist fashion, which really creates blockers for. And in fact, you might say that did exist 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and then that caused quite a crisis in relation to the pool of people that we have that we're now trying to do something about in terms of getting people more ready to take on those roles and wanting to take on those roles. But there are 7 principles in total. I'm not going to run through them. If listeners want to take a look, they can go onto the website. They're all there within the code. And we aim to obviously work on and incorporate the feedback we've got where necessary. We certainly will be ready by the spring conference on the 7th of June, if not before. Do you have an intel on a launch date at all, Helen? Or
I think, well, clearly I've not seen the consultation responses, so I don't know how extensive a piece of work we've still got to do, but hopefully we're nearly there. And I think the plan is to launch at the spring conference as things stand. And certainly, you know, I look forward to you know, that launch and sharing it with members in person. I think it's a really exciting piece of work, and it's you know, fantastic that LLG have been able to bring it forward alongside Phil, as you say, and CIPFA and Solace.
Yeah, it's been a great work stream, great piece of work. So I did say at the outset that I would return to elections, and we've heard a lot, haven't we, about from the sector around things like the digital imprint regime, voter ID. We've heard a lot of the, you know, the inability to get the staff, the venues, concerns around the debate not hate agenda. But what would you say, Helen, to anyone facing elections this year, perhaps for the first time? What would be your kind of rallying, supportive statement, and what should they be looking out for?
I think probably the first thing I would say, hopefully by way of reassurance, although it might not be that reassuring, is that actually it doesn't matter how long you've been involved in elections, that they are always daunting in the lead up. And, you know, quite often, and you come out the other side, you realise that the lead up is perhaps more daunting than the actual running of the election itself. And that's because they are huge military operations. And I think, you know, if you are facing elections for the first time, there is every chance that your authority will have well practiced arrangements in place for election preparations. I've never come across an electoral services team that, you know, doesn't have well established project planning arrangements, and, you know, have been adapting to the requirements of the Elections Act for several months in advance, and preparing. And, you know, going back to good leadership, you know, trust in that. So meet regularly as a team. If you're not the returning officer, certainly with the returning officer as well. Have oversight of that project plan and arrangements in place for escalating issues if things crop up and timetables are at risk of missing deadlines, etc. And have a risk register in place, which you review and monitor. You know, staffing is an issue, particularly with the requirements for additional staff in polling stations now. So I know there are offers from the government with regard to volunteers should you have challenges around that. So, you know, do reach out and take those offers if you're able to. If you've got proactive approaches with sort of FE colleges and things where you might actually be able to get some staff in should you be short. So that's kind of the practical running of things in terms of the actual, you know, the election itself. But the other thing I would recommend is actually reviewing what information you have and you put out for candidates and your members and also your officers. So, you know, whether that's pre-election publicity guidance, whether it's candidate information in terms of, you know, the codes of conducts, the register of interests, what to expect on their first day if they're elected, how they'll get their IT equipment, what information in relation to the member induction will there be. You know, you can front load a lot of that and actually address a number of queries, and then, you know, once members are elected and they've signed their code of conduct, you know, they've got a pack of information that they're ready to run with, which can be really, really helpful in advance. And with councillors and officers, particularly, you know, I get huge number of queries around campaign material and people complaining about it. Be really, really clear at the outset, as you're publishing your notice of election and your pre-election publicity guidance, what you can and what you can't deal with, and then what you will be signposting either to the Electoral Commission or the police, for example, and just sort of set those expectations at the very outset. That can actually help just manage communications throughout the elections period when you're busy trying to make sure that the preparations are running smoothly. And then, of course, look outside of your organisation for support. So I think we've missed the LLG elections conference for this year. It was held a few weeks ago, I think. But we do have a monitoring officer lunchtime session on the 25th of April, and we've got Mark Heath, who is returning officer at Southampton and works very closely with the Association of Electoral Administrators, and he'll be doing a bit of a session around a week away from the election, what should we be concentrating on and making sure we've got in place. Get to know your local electoral commission representative, meet with them in advance, make sure that they're comfortable with the preparations that you've gone through. And then once the election's over and you've kind of had a big sigh of relief that everything's gone smoothly, actually have a debrief. Meet with the team after the election once the dust is settled and just go, right, okay, what worked well and what didn't work well. And if you have had some issues, what can you do to ensure that they don't arise in the future?
Spectacular advice there, Helen, actually. Really, really great. And yeah, if members want to attend the monitoring officers group that you referred to, then that's listed on the events page of the LLG website. So finally, Helen, you've been not only employed in the local government legal sector for a really long time now, but you've been involved with LLG and its predecessor company for something like, it must be going on 18 years or something. Is that right?
I think it's nearer 20, Helen.
Yeah, I apologise.
It's still a long time.
I'm still in denial, Helen, about that passage of time, because I think we broadly became involved around the same time, I think.
Yeah, I joined in my first role in 2004. June 2004, I joined LLG. Well, it was SLG then. It was Solicitors in Local Government, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah. So given that, what's driven you to not only a lifetime of dedication to the public sector as a career, but also to volunteer your time for such a long period in a variety of roles, which you have held, to support the sector? What drives you?
Well, I think in terms of my career in choosing local government, I think the thing that attracted me was the variety of a career in local government, and actually the level of responsibility and the things that you can get involved in at quite an early stage in your career, because resources are short. So if you're competent and keen, then you can get involved in all sorts of things that you perhaps wouldn't otherwise in a junior role elsewhere. So I think that was the first thing that kind of drew me into local government. And I firmly believe in public sector values, and I think the pandemic showed us that what really highlighted what an important role local authorities play, which is often overlooked and undervalued. So that's why I chose local government. And then in terms of sort of my contribution to LLG and I suppose the developing the local government lawyers of the future and the statutory officers of the future, it goes back to that point you were saying about good leaders. I was really very fortunate to have worked with leaders who encouraged me to develop both my networks, but also provided me with development opportunities.
Yeah.
And working in that environment not only gave me a huge amount of experience, which led me to where I am today, but gave me a huge amount of job satisfaction. And so I've loved every minute of it. And I see the roles that I've taken with LLG as a real opportunity to give back, and I suppose offer those opportunities to others in the sector. Although I would say, Helen, it's not entirely selfless, because I do benefit from the LLG as well, particularly with regard to the network. Having been a member since I started out, I have developed a fantastic support network, and I've got a list of people who if I've got a particular issue or I just need a bit of moral support, there's any number of people that I can reach out to, and I think that is absolutely invaluable, and it really is crucial if you're a statutory officer that needs a safe space to pick up the phone and have a conversation.
Completely, or even a junior who feels that they can't talk, they're nervous about raising anything within their authority. I mean, getting involved in LLG really does provide a sort of family network of people who will support you and stay with you throughout your career and your journey, in fact.
Absolutely, and it knows no hierarchy. So,
No.
I offer a phone a friend service, as you know, and it started out for monitoring officers, but I do occasionally get other members reach out to me and say, "Can I run this past you?" or "What about this and what about that?" And actually, just having a conversation for 15, 20 minutes can make such a difference to somebody who perhaps is otherwise, worrying about something, and having that sort of, as you say, that safe space is really important. I've always had it, and so I hope that members going forward are able to benefit from it as well.
I hope so too. That's certainly the aim of LLG, to enable that to continue. And on that note, you can read all about developments in local government law and practice by going to bulletin number 12, available on the LLG website now. And why not watch the LLG vlog this week with guest appearance from Rachel McCoy, who's our outgoing LLG president. And excitingly, you can also follow us on Spotify by searching for the LLG Grapevine. So all that remains is for me to thank Helen. Thank you for joining me today, Helen.
Thanks, Helen.
And have a good week, everyone.